How Africa is becoming China's Africa. China was once considered the factory of the world. Slowly but surely, the Asian power is passing on that mantle to Africa, while simultaneously increasing the Chinese sphere of global influence. In this enlightening, fast-paced video, we examine recent shifts in the geopolitical climate to discover how China has managed to mold Africa into China's Africa, a trend that will become more pronounced in the years to come. We believe manufacturers seeking a comparative advantage ought to take note of China's strategy to Africa. Before the end of this video, you're going to realize how Africa is becoming China's. Please subscribe and turn on the notification bell as we continue. A lot of African economies now rely heavily on Chinese loans, technology initiatives, infrastructure investments, and weaponry. The China-Africa Partnership will be used by the Chinese Communist Party to increase its influence on the African continent. By taking a more active approach in the conflicts affecting the continent, China will look to strengthen its military cooperation with African states. Due to the political and social unrest throughout Africa, China will be able to act as a moderator and sponsor. If state rifts persist, its influence is likely to grow significantly. Due to unfair trade practices, China's investment will cause the economies of Africa to stagnate. Long-term technological projects will benefit China, but the populations of Africa will only gain very little. Since it depends on China for most of the innovation, such as infrastructural development and so on. Considering these events, the People's Republic of China demonstrated to the world in the 21st century that authoritarian nations can develop their economies, even if this necessitates employing alternative strategies. This fact is especially important for the African continent, where only 9 out of 54 nations have a democratic system of government. 3 main policy frameworks can be used to trace China's security commitment to Africa. Its National Defense Policy, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation FOCAC summits held every 3 years since 2000, and since 2006, its official Africa policy. The United Nations continue to list China as a developing nation. Africa now plays a significant role in China's foreign policy, and China's seat on the United Nations Security Council gives it considerable leverage in pursuing its interests. On the global stage, the effects of China's rise are still up for debate. Others see China as the freerider of the global economic system, while some see China as a balancing force in the world order that is heavily dominated by the West. However, everyone has a significant point with respect to what is happening in Africa right now. States in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are still requesting large loans from the Chinese bank. Major investments are made in nations with high levels of political instability to appear as though the economy is growing. Since the 2000s, the majority of African nations have grown increasingly interested in siding with China and shunning the United States. More recently, Russia has also shown a willingness to use its influence, particularly in areas of conflict where the Kremlin hopes to gain leverage by assisting struggling governments. Africa's conflict zones offer China and Russia a chance to test their militaries and equipment. China is currently the only country having the most say in ruling Africa. Looking at China-Africa relationship in the economic perspectives, according to the government of Africa, working with China has 3 benefits. China is interested in both resources and products of Africa in terms of trade. The African states receive sizable sums of money from the export of materials like iron ore, gold, oil, and others. Second, because labor cost in Africa is low, the Chinese government established numerous manufacturing businesses there. Chinese jobs are extremely valuable for nations where the unemployment rate is 30 or 50%, like the DRC and Angola. The Chinese Import-Export Bank additionally provides loans with low or no interest. These loans offer a special chance for struggling African nations because no other bank would take the risk of making a loan that might not be repaid. Infrastructure initiatives financed by China, like the $3.2 billion Kenyan Railway, the $526 million dam in Guinea, or the $475 million light rail system in Ethiopia, appear to boost the economies of the continent. China is more interested in investing in mining and agriculture projects that can boost the Chinese economy than in getting its money back. China has taken on the position of an international conflict mediator in an effort to maximize its soft power. The Chinese Communist Party can continue to project the image of a responsible global power thanks to this new position. In order to balance the Trump administration's policies, Xi Jinping wants China to be viewed as a pacifying player on the international stage by the year 2049, which he emphasized in his speech. Additionally, through economic assistance and mediation, China may be able to exert some long-term influence over the course of government in nations with dictatorial or mixed regimes. The Chinese Communist Party is able to preserve this balance between the regimes that adhere more closely to its ideology and the democratic sphere of influence. Looking at the political aspects, another appealing aspect of the alliance is China's publicly declared commitment to refraining from meddling in the politics of other nations. The majority of African nations have dictatorial or hybrid regimes, which require the United States or United Nations to impose stringent requirements before granting any aid. Hybrid regimes combine democracy and dictatorship. Although less obvious, Chinese politics are also having an impact on the Chinese Communist Party economic alliance with African governments. An African country recognizing Taiwan as a state will receive on average 2.7 fewer Chinese infrastructure projects each year, while an African country voting along with China in the United Nations General Assembly receives 1.8 more infrastructure per year. There are other institutions such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank that offer low-interest loans. However, China is the only country with no requirement on respecting human rights or holding democratic elections. Security in Africa remains a challenge as a result of insufficient interstate cooperation, despite the African Union's efforts to improve communication among its members. Future ethnic, religious, and territorial disputes are expected to cause increased tensions between nations. It's only the second time in its history that China has sent combat troops to a United Nations peacekeeping mission, and that mission is the Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA. The People's Liberation Army of China has used its participation in Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali to test new military hardware, train its personnel to operate in an aggressive environment, and gain experience working with other United Nations commissions. In recent years, China's military and security ties to Africa have drawn criticism from the international community. Human rights organizations and Western governments have called attention to certain African nations, including the DRC, Sudan, and Zimbabwe in particular. Looking at regional conflicts, China responded by saying it obeys the international laws and avoids exporting military hardware to nations on which the United Nations Security Council has imposed an embargo. Statistics, however, demonstrate that army deals were struck with nations like South Sudan and Cameroon, where inter-ethnic strife led to coups and massive killings. For instance, insurgent leaders from South Sudan placed an order in 2013 for 1,200 Red Arrow 73 anti-tank missiles, which the Chinese government delivered in 2014 while the conflict was still raging. The frequency of high-level military exchanges between China and Africa grew towards the late 90s, then remained constant until 2009 and began to grow again from 2010. Although diplomatic relations exist with all African states, China has stronger military ties with Algeria Angola, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Sudan, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. Let it be known that China trains African military personnel, participates in joint military drills, and conducts humanitarian aid, including search and rescue missions. Either Chinese instructors offer training in African nations or African military personnel travel to China for training. The political military ties between China and Ethiopia are one illustration. The Ethiopian army, which was reorganized following the Eritrea conflict in 2000 and now has 130,000 well-armed soldiers on staff, is regarded as one of the most skilled and effective military forces in Africa. The Ethiopian army is now purchasing weaponry, light armored vehicles, and troop transport vehicles from China. Unknown numbers of Ethiopian police officers receive training each year. Ethiopia has been one of the 14 nations in Africa where the Chinese embassy has a military representative since 2007. Algeria, Cameroon, Tanzania, South Africa, Morocco, Nigeria, Sudan, and South Sudan were among the countries that purchased a significant amount of military hardware between 2012 and 2017. However, we can authoritatively conclude that China is putting more effort in Africa through lending loans to African countries, making them dependent on the Chinese, since most of the loans can't be refunded. China clearly devotes a lot of attention and resources to Africa, but not to the extent you might believe, given the extent to which they have gained influence across the entire continent. There are two significant figures to consider. China only loaned $12 billion to African nations in 2015, while also making just $3 billion of investment there. That may not seem like much, but the fact that the Chinese government no longer needs to pressure this phenomenon explains why China is gaining such a significant amount of influence over the continent. Private Chinese industry is establishing itself in Africa among the estimated 10,000 Chinese companies there. Instead of being one of the many state-run businesses in China, 90% of them are privately owned. The Chinese government undoubtedly gave the industrialization of Africa a significant push, but now that that has been accomplished, economic forces are driving the initiative further forward. The Chinese companies operating in Africa are actually profitable. A large portion of the Western world is unaware to the prospects of the continent, ignoring the fact that business in Africa can now be as profitable as business in China was when its period of tremendous growth began. Chinese small businesses are engulfing the continent. Africa is currently establishing itself as China's primary source of labor and resources, and until the West pays attention, it will continue to advance towards that goal. So far, this is how Africa is becoming China's Africa. Thanks for staying with us up until now. We have more educative videos about Africa on our channel. Before you go to the next one, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave us a comment. Let's know your opinions on this video.